All right, so the last panel up today. So the remaining schedule, we've got one more panel to go. Then Tony's going to talk to us for a little bit, and then we'll go feed you some lunch, and then you've got the rest of the day to think about what we've talked about today. So what we want to do with this panel is the impetus for this, and I'll speak for the governor on this, the impetus for wanting to put together a discussion forum like this, a series of presentations like this, came out of a series of presentations that both the governor and I saw when we were at an event that was put on by former Governor Bush and his foundation about what had been done in other states, models from other states, things that had been done, and so forth. That was like I want to say a 2-day. It was a long conference, a lot of stuff. So we're doing kind of a compact version of that. But one of the pieces we wanted to talk about is what we sort of shorthanded called the Florida story, which is when you look across the states and you look at what kind of states have seen performance gains over the last few years, it's pretty remarkable what we've seen from Florida. So the question is, and the question that happened that sort of was generated at this forum we were at last fall was, what exactly is it that Florida is doing? What kind of pieces have they put in place, some of which have been in place for a long time? I think, as Eric said before, you've had Florida's taken the lead on some of these issues going back many, many years. And so they sort of got a head start on a lot of the rest of us doing this. So what we're going to get is kind of a quick presentation looking broadly at the suite of reforms that Florida put in place, what the effect of those reforms were, and really give us a sense of here's a state, as opposed to looking at report cards and these states and that states and these states have this grade and so on and so forth. Let's look at a state that has seen pretty remarkable achievement growth over the last few years and see if we can figure out what are the ingredients in that, and is there anything there that we here in Maine can learn and take from that. So on the panel to share with us the Florida story is Matt Ladner. Dr. Ladner, I've known for a while from the think tank days, and he's now a senior policy advisor at the Foundation for Excellence in Education, formerly at Goldwater, not still at Goldwater, formerly at Goldwater Institute, which was a state-based think tank, and has been doing research in this area for a long, long time. Patricia Levesque is here, who's the CEO of the Foundation for Excellence in Education. This is former Governor Bush's foundation that is really working in states and looking at different things that states have done, producing research and so forth. And Mike Thomas also is at the foundation and has done work there looking and, again, reporting on what kind of changes have been seen, what happened in Florida specifically, and we'll be able to sort of give us some of that context as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt to run the panel, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.
All right. And
Yes.
you've got
I have
the
this.
portable if you want the portable. So there you go.
Portable sounds good. Oop. Is this working?
They'll bring it.
What about now? There we go. Great. Well, great. Thanks for having me out here. I'm the person on the panel who's the token non-Floridian. I'm actually from Texas, and I grew up in Texas and live in Arizona now. So I live catty-corner to you guys, way on the other end of the country in the southwest. And out in Arizona, where I've lived for the last decade, just about 5 or 6 years ago, a research report came out that reported a panel presentation. There was a demographer going through a PowerPoint presentation like the one I'm about to do with you guys. And this person was making a presentation, and he clicked up a map of the Southwest, okay, including the state of Texas, where I was born, New Mexico, Arizona, where I live now, Nevada, California, pops the map up on the screen and says, oh, and by the way, this is going to be the Appalachia of the 21st century. Click, next slide. There's a gasp from the audience, and the audience says, whoa, 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 Dr. So-and-so, what are you talking about? Go back to that slide. And he says, oh, okay, well, look, it's very simple. Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, California, all of these states have become what we call majority-minority K12 systems, right? This has been driven by a very large increase in the Hispanic populations in these states. And he said, well, what do we know about how Hispanics do in school? It's pretty grim. We can look at standardized test scores, NAPE scores. We can look at graduation rates. We can look at college attendance rates. We can look at college completion rates. And we all see the same story. Now that these students, for instance, the state that I grew up in, Texas, is more than a majority of students are Hispanics. Okay. He said, you look at all the stats, this is what's going to happen. Well, one of the authors of the report raised her hand, and she said, well, Dr. So-and-so, you're making an awful assumption, right? You're either assuming that these states cannot or will not do better than they have in the past. And this person leaned into the microphone and said, like I said, this will be the Appalachia of the 21st century. Okay. For those of us who live in the Southwest or grow up in the Southwest and love the Southwest, this is, very chilling because all the statistics that this person showed are true. All of them are. Okay, whether it's, all the graduation rates, all the student achievement rates, all of that is true. What he was wrong about is the fact that states have to accept this. And what he was wrong about was that states can't do any better. And if you look at the nation's report card data, which a lot of this data we're going to be drawing from, Jeannie mentioned it earlier. It's the most reliable set of K12 testing data in the country. It's given by the federal government to a random sample of students in all 50 states. And it turns out that by random circumstances that I won't go into, I happen to be the person to discover this. Okay, I was looking closely at the NAPE data. I was involved in a debate about which reform should we do. Sometimes, those of us who are policy nerds get into these ridiculous arguments about, well, should we do this reform or that reform? And my perspective was, and this particular debate was, should we give parents more options or should we do a better job doing student testing? And my take on this debate was, yes, that's what we should do. We should do both of those things, right? They're not mutually exclusive, so we should be doing both of them. And I came away from that debate and I asked myself, well, if that's true, I ought to be able to demonstrate that it's actually worked somewhere. So I started digging into the NAPE data and I thought, well, Florida's done a good job with student testing. Florida's done more to expand parental options than any other state. Why don't I go look at Florida's NAPE scores? That's when I discovered this. Sitting in my office in Phoenix, Arizona, I discovered that Florida's Hispanic students, in isolation, outscored the statewide average for all students in a great number of states, okay, including my state of Arizona. In Arizona, this gap is not a small one. It's a large gap. When you only look at Hispanics in Florida, they are scoring better on fourth grade reading than all students in Arizona by more than a grade level's worth of progress, okay? This is a test given only in English, okay? All of our students in Arizona are included in our NAPE data, okay? All of our kids in Scottsdale, the Catalina Foothills, Prescott, Flagstaff, I don't know how many of you have been to Arizona, right? Every single one of our students in our sample is in our statewide average. Florida's Hispanic students are beating us by more than a grade level, okay? This is good news because it's especially good news for those states that are experiencing profound demographic change, which is eventually going to come to all states. Now, recently, Stanford economist Eric Hanushek created this chart. I think this chart is incredibly revealing, so I wanted to kind of walk you through it a little bit, right? Because it's extremely illuminating. What he's done here is to track the states, all the states that have participated in NAPE since the early 1990s, okay? So the dots are states. He's tracked the increase in expenditure per pupil 1990 to 2009 down the bottom, okay? This is not the total spending. It is the increase in spending during that period, okay? And then he has tracked the amount of improvement in the total NAPE scores for each state, okay? So do that, you do your scatter plot, right? First question we'll ask, what state do you not want to be on this chart? Yeah. I know everyone always jots right to their own state. We'll get to that, okay? I would say the state you do not want to be on this chart is Wyoming, okay? Wyoming had a $6,000 per student increase in K-12 funding, but had academic growth below the national average. That line is basically the national average for NAPE increase. And by the way, these are percents of a standard deviation, so that's real nerd speak, but basically what it means is it's an annual rate. So small differences between these dots can make a big difference because it's like compound interest, okay? The state you don't want to be is Wyoming, New York, okay? What state do you want to be on this chart? That would be Florida. Florida had an increase in spending per pupil, but it was the smallest in the country. It's around $1,000 per child, okay? But experienced the second highest amount of academic growth in the country, okay? Just getting edged out by Maryland, okay? That is mostly the result of reforms, of repurposing existing funding streams. There is still a public school system in Florida. It spends more than it ever has. It employs more people than it ever has, right? And is doing a much better job educating the students, okay? Now, since you're all from Maine, or most of you from Maine, I'm sure you found where you are, okay? This does not mean that Maine has low scores, okay? Let's be clear about that, okay? Look, I want to be, it's natural. Sometimes when I do presentations like this, people can become defensive. Let me be very clear about this. Maine has above average NAPE scores, okay? I'll go one further. I live in Arizona. If I could make quantum duplicates of the 657 schools here in Maine and take them to Arizona with me, I'd do it in a second, okay? That's not what this is about, okay? This is not about, is Maine have a bad public education system, does a good public, that's not the deal, okay? The question we should all be asking is, how can Maine have the best public education system possible? How can you be even better than you are now? How can you do the most to prepare the most number of students, equip them with the literacy and numeracy skills they are going to need to succeed in life moving forward, okay? That's the question. Are we good, or are we good compared to Florida, are we good compared to Arizona, whatever, okay? Where are we now? How can we get better? What this chart is telling you is that for the last, good 19-year period here, what Maine experienced was stagnation in terms of increasing academic, achievement. You can do better than that, okay? Florida is not the only example you should look at. You should draw experiences and study experiences from a number of states. Let me just say off the bat, too, Florida is not education nirvana, okay? Florida used to be one of the lowest performing states on NAPE. It's made a lot of improvement. Tony, I think, would agree. I know Patricia would, right? That Florida still has plenty of issues to work out. But what they have done is prove that demography is not destiny, okay? That's really important, especially to those of us who live in the Southwest. As you guys move forward in Maine, I would say that what you want to do is, to focus on the ideals and the goals and the purpose of your public education system, okay? To some extent, you might have to change your practices, right? You might have to change the status quo to get the kind of growth you want and need and your kids deserve, okay? With that, I'll turn it over for a while to Patricia, who will tell you the actual Florida story. You want this?
Can you hear me? Hello? Okay. I'm going to stay seated for my portion of the presentation and go through a lot of PowerPoint slides. And so I have to start off by saying I heard someone say that people who use PowerPoints have no power and no point. I hope that is not the way you feel at the end of the PowerPoint presentation. I am going to talk a lot about Florida because that's what this particular panel is about. But it is not, as Matt said, to say, ooh, look at how great Florida is. It is not that at all. What we used to refer to Florida on NAPE data as being, thank God for Louisiana and Mississippi, because but for them, we would have been at the very bottom of national achievement on student tests and student learning. And what we did, I've also heard described in the late 90s and early 2000s, is Florida was basically, if anyone remembers the old Life cereal commercials, we were Mikey from the Life cereal commercials. We were so bad, we would try anything because we just wanted to get better. We wanted to make sure that our kids had some pathway for future success. And so what I'm going to spend a little bit of time going through today is what were many of those things that Florida tried where we've had some success, because maybe some of those things are things that you may want to consider as you evaluate how to move Maine forward in terms of student performance. This slide just gives you a little bit of demographic data. So it's a relatively large state, 2.7 million students. 57% of our students are low income, which means for the progress that we have been able to make in improving student learning, it was made with a lot of very low income, disadvantaged students. So that means the gains maybe mean a little bit more because it was students who were so struggling and that we've gotten them to a level where they possibly have a chance for success in the future. So this chart is NAPE data. Again, Matt's talked about NAPE data as being the only test that now all 50 states participate in. We started with 1998 data only because that was the year before Florida started all of those different reforms that we were trying to implement to help improve our public education system. And the red line, the one that represents Florida, is really what I want you to notice. 10 points on this scale is about a grade level. So in 1998, Florida fourth graders were nearly 2 grade levels below Maine fourth graders in reading. And fast forward to now, we're basically average, tied with Maine students. That is not, again, to say, oh, look at how great Florida is, but to look how far we came. We're the only state in the country that has made this type of gains with a large population of low-income students, at-risk, disadvantaged. And so maybe some of the things that we did can be helpful to other states. Let's skip through some of these other NAPE slides and talk about, well, what were some of the things we did? One of the things we did was we started grading our schools a different way. We used a nomenclature back in the mid-90s where we labeled schools high-performing and performing and low-performing and critically low-performing. We went to a brilliant system in 1998 where we said, okay, we're going to grade schools levels 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The problem was no one knew whether you wanted to be a level 5 school or a level 1 school. The nomenclature was not clear. We work with a lot of states, and I'll give you an example of a state that I think had really confusing nomenclature, and that was Virginia. The state of Virginia nomenclature for their schools was fully accredited, conditionally accredited with probation, and then denied accreditation. And nobody knew really, if you asked parents, what was your school, they didn't know. And people also didn't understand that state accreditation was actually different than accreditation from like a regional accrediting association or accreditation for high school athletics or something like that. So Florida decided we're going to grade our schools the way we grade our students. And all we really did was change the nomenclature to A, B, C, D, F. Now, I'm going to ask for a show of hands. How many people know that A and B is good, D and F is bad, and C means there's room for improvement? Almost every hand went up. And when Governor McDonnell started talking about doing this in the state of Virginia, his point was, you've won half the battle if the nomenclature is something that people already understand. People may not understand completely how you grade schools. They might not understand all of the different factors that go into the calculation, but an ABCDF letter grade gives the public, gives parents, gives newspapers, gives the media a better sense of, in general, with what we consider important for our schools, which ones are doing the best jobs, which ones are really struggling, which ones have a lot of room for improvement. This is basically how we grade our schools. Half of the grade is based on proficiency, which means are the kids on grade level or higher in reading, writing, math, and science? And then half the grade is on progress. And progress means how did Patricia in 5th grade do compared to how she performed in 4th grade? And that individual student progress is really important because you can't have a teacher or a school a teacher who's in 7th grade, let's say, who is receiving a child who may be performing at the 5th grade level. You can't expect that teacher in 1 year to get that student to 7th grade level by the end of the year. But we should want every teacher to move every child from wherever they started the school year to grow and to get better under that teacher's teaching. And so when Florida started including growth in our school calculation, we found a couple of things happened. D and F schools improved and they started getting C and D grades. And that's because we were giving credit to those schools for making progress with probably the really disadvantaged students that they were receiving. The other thing that it did is really high income, well-to-do schools, some of them dropped from A and B down to B and C. And that is because they were not keeping their high-performing kids high-performing from year to year. Those students that came to them high-performing might have slipped a little bit. And so we balance our grading of schools to be half based on proficiency, half on progress. Everything that I just showed you is how we grade elementary and middle schools, and it's half the high school grade. The other part of the high school grade looks at graduation rates of at-risk students, so those students who came into the high school below grade level out of 8th grade, how many of those students ended up completing 4 years later. We look at acceleration rates, which for us include college and industry measures. So how many students are taking AP, IB, dual enrollment, or industry certification courses? Because for us, the end goal out of high school should be that students are going on to college or they're going to go successfully into a career. And so we want to make sure that the schools are balancing students going on to a college or getting meaningful industry certificates in order to go in the workforce. And we look at college readiness rates. So this is basically what the state looked like when we started grading schools, A through F. The red line is the D and F schools, and the blue line are A and B schools. And you can see in 1999, the first year we started grading schools, we had more D and F schools than A and B schools. Fast forward to last year, where we have nearly 10 times as many A and B schools and as D and F schools. And the dotted arrows are points in time where we raised the bar. We didn't want to set a bar at the beginning that was so high that no one could achieve it, but we also didn't want to set a bar and then leave the bar there, because not raising the bar, it will let status quo. Status quo is like gravity. If you're mountain climbing and you're going up a mountain, as soon as you stop moving and you lose your momentum, gravity starts pulling you backwards. And so one of the principles, one of the things that we really tried to do in Florida was constantly raise the bar, constantly challenge our schools and teachers and students to reach a little higher. These have been the results. Now, practically speaking, what happened when we started grading our schools A through F? Well, one, there was transparency. So people understood A, B, C, D, F. They kind of knew how their school was doing. When you travel the state and you talk to educators and principals, one of the things that they want a lot is parental involvement, parental engagement. That's just something that we hear a lot when we travel. Let me tell you, A through F grading gets a lot of parental engagement. And it is because parents finally have some information and know about how their schools are doing. In Oklahoma, I'll give you an example. They started grading their schools A through F last year. And the day that they released their A through F letter grades, they had 25,000 more hits on their State Department website than the total number of students in the state of Oklahoma. A lot of people, once they were issuing something that was meaningful, really wanted to find out how their child's school was doing. I'll give you one other story about that. When we were releasing letter grades, one of the people that I worked with whose children were not in the public school system was going to a bank and was waiting to be helped, and saw these two bank tellers that were not waiting on individuals. And he was leaning over, what were these two moms so engrossed in? And they were standing around a computer looking up their child's school's grade on the day of the school grade release. And those moms ended up high-fiving each other because their school had just gotten a B. And that staffer then asked a couple more questions and found out the schools had been D's the year before. And those parents were so excited because they were seeing progress was being made in their child's school. The third thing that A through F letter grades really do, they bring a command focus on learning. And I'll give you an example of that. I grew up in Central Florida, really poor part of the town, and I was zoned for a school that would have been an F school, Evans High School. And Evans High School was not, when I was zoned there 20-something years ago, was not a school that you really wanted to send your child to. But it wasn't until Evans High School started getting an F and another F did the school board members on the north side of town care about what was going on with that south side high school? And I'm proud to say that Evans High School is getting a B letter grade now. And it's because people got invested in making sure that they didn't have an F school in their county, in their district. They didn't want it. They wanted to make sure kids were learning. One of the other policies that Florida put in place was a policy on reading. And we did it well before the Casey Foundation came out with their research. But the Casey Foundation came out with research that said that 88% of high school dropouts, you could track it back to those children not being proficient third grade readers. So if any state wants to tackle their high school graduation or dropout crisis, you have to start looking in the elementary grades. I think Kate mentioned one of the most important skills that teachers need to learn how to teach is reading. And that is the primary thing you want kids to learn in elementary. So what Florida did, we did a lot of things with test-based promotion policies and early literacy screeners and personalized intervention for children who were behind. But we also adopted a policy that said we're not going to push students to fourth grade unless they're ready, because from kindergarten through third grade, children are still learning how to read. But when they hit fourth grade, they're expected to read their material in order to learn. And so we adopted a policy that said students who score at the very lowest level on our state test, a level 1, those students we were going to take another look at before they were promoted to fourth grade. And students, it wasn't just based on a single test score. Let me go back. I didn't put the good cause exemptions, but teachers could put together a portfolio of a child's work to show during the school year this child really did demonstrate that the child could read, but they had a bad test day, or we let other test data work into the equation. But basically, our children, through one of 2 or 3 measures, have to demonstrate that they have basic reading skills in order to move to fourth grade. Now, this chart shows what happened in 2000-2001. We had 29% of our children that we knew could not read. We knew that they were functionally illiterate, but we were promoting nearly 27% of them to fourth grade, where we knew they would be struggling. You can see the year in 2002-2003 where we put this policy in place where you had to demonstrate competency in order to move to fourth grade. And it was a very painful year that year to retain 14% of your third graders. But the good news on the chart is we're reducing the percent of kids who can't read. We are reducing every year the percent of students who need to be retained. Let me tell you functionally what our school district started doing. They started intervening earlier. So our standards at the time said students in kindergarten should recognize, I want to say it was at least 20 letters of the alphabet was what our standards said at the time. But yet in many cases, schools were promoting a child out of kindergarten who didn't recognize a single letter of the alphabet and expecting the teacher the next year to catch that child up. And so what districts, when they finally realized we're going to face this real line where we're going to have to show the child has basic reading skills to move the child to fourth grade, they started intervening earlier. And first of all, let me tell you, it's a tough policy on, especially on third grade teachers, but fourth and fifth grade teachers really appreciate it because they finally start receiving kids that are ready for the material, and teachers have a narrower variation in the reading skills of those fourth graders that then they can move forward. The Manhattan Institute did some research 2 years after the program was put in place and found that the students that had been given specific intervention and more time outperformed those students who had just been passed along and socially promoted. Marcus Winters did a follow-up study through middle school and found that you could still see the benefits of that earlier intervention policy through 7th grade in the reading and math scores and the science scores of those students. Now, the second class of children that were first under that policy will be reaching their senior year this year. And so researchers are going to take another look next year to find out how did this policy really impact those first classes of children. And hopefully our research can drive decisions that you may or may not decide to make here in Maine. This chart is a chart on our state test. Our state test is called the FCAT. And I want you to really look at that blue line. You can see for years we had flat performance on reading in middle school. 3 years in a row where we didn't budge an inch on getting more kids prepared for reading. But then all of a sudden in 2006, we had a huge increase. And so we reached out to our principals and said, what's the difference? What happened? And principals said, we are finally receiving kids out of elementary school that are better prepared for middle school, so that the middle schools weren't having to do the catch-up work of the elementary schools. And you can practically trace that back to the year we implemented a policy that said students need to demonstrate that they are ready in reading in order to move to the 4th grade. The first class of better prepared 4th graders in 2004, they were in 5th grade in 2005, and they reached middle school in 2006. What were some of the other policies that we did? One, we wanted to incentivize rigor. We wanted to incentivize school districts with new money. This was new money that we put into the formula in order to help them get kids better prepared for college. We noticed that one of the early indicators for a student going to college was that they would take the SAT or the ACT. One of an indicator of them taking the SAT or ACT was, did the kids take the PSAT or the plan test? And we found that in our A-graded schools, 85% of the kids took the PSAT. In our F-graded schools, less than 15% of students were taking those tests. And when we met with the principals said there's 2 reasons. One is there's a cost to the test that the kids can't afford. And the second is there's a stigma of being the only child in that school that was going to take the PSAT test. So we said we want to level the playing field. And so we started providing funding for all children in 10th grade to take either the PSA or the PSAT or the plan test. Our school districts decide which one they want to administer. We started putting money from the state into professional development so that teachers, especially teachers at our C, D, and F schools, could get training in how to teach the more rigorous AP courses. And then we started providing some bonuses. Whenever a teacher got a child to successfully pass an AP course for college credit, that teacher got a bonus. Here were the results for putting in place a very small, from a funding perspective, a small amount of money, but aligning that money in the best interest of the child, giving the children the opportunity to take harder courses, paying for those tests for those courses, and incentivizing teachers to help those kids succeed. You can see we had huge progress in kids taking the AP and students successfully passing AP. The primary beneficiaries, especially for a state like Florida that's a primarily minority, low-income state, have been our African American and Hispanic students that now lead their peers across the country in earning college credit in high school. And one of the benefits that has for our parents is when those children earn college credit in high school, it saves them money in college. And students who earn college credit in high school are more likely to actually pursue college. We did a lot of stuff with quality educators, and I'm not going to go over some of the policies that we put in place that you've heard from the last panel, but I do want to talk about one of the things that we did in trying to find alternative routes for individuals to enter the classroom. Now, in the early 2000s, Florida was growing by 60,000 students a year. We were needing to recruit about 32,000 teachers a year just to keep up with attrition and growth in student enrollment. So we and our state universities were producing about 6,000 teacher graduates a year. So we had to find more teachers to come and teach in Florida. What we did was we started accepting full reciprocity. Florida accepts teaching certificates from all 50 states. No questions asked. We'll accept your teaching certificate. We also accept the National Board, American Board teaching certificates. We also started letting our community colleges become places where adults who already had their bachelor's degree could go and get their teacher pedagogy training instead of having to go to a state university. Because for Florida, our community colleges were more regionally closer to where citizens lived. We also had all of our school districts offer district alternative teacher certification programs. We started recognizing if you had taught in higher ed for at least 2 years, we would accept that teaching experience for purposes of teaching certificates. And we did some other things with requiring our universities to offer education as a minor, not just as a major. I will tell you, 2 years after the policy was put in place, we were hiring more teachers through alternative routes to teacher certification than through traditional colleges of education. At the same time, student performance was still increasing. So I think that goes to some of the things that Kate says. If you have good measurement before a person gets their teaching certificate, a good reading test, a good math test, a good subject area test, and then you couple that with good mentoring and professional development at the local level, that will get you a quality teacher to have in front of your classrooms. I'm going to skip through some of the teacher effectiveness stuff and then turn it over to Matt. We did also in Florida a lot of school choice policy. And
Yeah, Florida's been. Hello.
You can use mine. It's on. No, this one's on now. Yeah.
Just microphone chase here. Okay, so Florida's probably done more to expand parental options than any other state. They have a lot of charter schools. They have the largest school voucher program in the country, which is for children with disabilities, called the McKay Scholarship Program. They have tax credits for low-income kids to go to different schools. A very large pre-K voucher program. Digital learning. Florida's the sort of national leader on that. The program I want to focus on is the McKay Scholarship Program. This is only for children with disabilities. Either you have an IEP or Section 504 now. And it is about 27,000 students. The interesting thing to me about this is that, let's see if I can get to this chart. This program has been statewide in Florida since 2001, I believe. You look at it today, there are about 5% of children with disabilities in Florida that are actively using the program and have transferred to a private school, okay? There are more children with disabilities in Florida public schools today than when the program passed and went statewide in 2001, okay? But when you go back to the NAPE and you look at the combined learning gains for students with disabilities across the states, what you see is that Florida has made the largest gains, okay? I think I put, let's see, Maine, I think Maine there, yeah, Maine's the green one there, so you can see where Maine kind of falls. This is across 4 different NAPE tests. So on average, basically children with disabilities in Florida are doing about a grade and a half level better in 2011 than they had been back in 2003, where this is starts. So this is the period where all 50 states are taking the NAPE test, starting in 2003. That is not just because of the McKay program. Let me be very clear about that. There are a lot of policy areas in the way, for instance, the way you grade schools that have implications for moving the academic achievement of children with disabilities forward. However, we do have evaluations that show that public school students with disabilities actually, when their schools face a higher level of competition simply because there's more private schools around participating in the McKay Scholarship Program, they've had larger than average academic gains. So for many years, state legislators and federal lawmakers have been met with the complaint that schools don't get enough money for special needs children, right? I mean, I think we've all heard this. All the McKay program does is allow people to leave with their state funding, right? So the local funding that had been going in to supplement from general education to special education, you can either keep doing that and spend more on the special need kids you have, or you can keep it back in general ed. But basically, this is a program that helps some of the most disadvantaged kids and hurts absolutely no one.
So a couple of the other programs that we run, there's a tax credit program for low-income students, so corporations can get a credit on their taxes for giving to a scholarship organization that gives public or private school choice options for low-income students. It has about 50,000 students in the program. This program's been in place for 14 years now. and research shows that it saves our state money that we can plow back into the public school system, and the students that are participating on the program are actually outperforming their peers, even though the students that are on this program are lower income than the total low-income population in our public schools. We did a lot of things with charter schools, from removing the caps to allowing municipalities to run schools in their area, to letting our community colleges run what we call dual enrollment charters, so the students graduate with their high school diploma and the associate's degree at the same time. And because we've had so many years worth of charters, we wanted, the state doesn't, and let me say, we don't believe in school choice is the silver bullet to cure all the woes in public education. We also don't believe that all school choice options are good and high quality. What we want is to offer high quality options for students. And so Florida actually started raising the bar on our charter schools. And so only charters that are deemed high quality, so they get A's or B's, they have a good clean financial audit, those charters have the ability to grow more rapidly. They can expand their enrollment, add grade levels, and have a faster pass, to use a Disney term, in order to open up new charters in the state. We also have a policy where if our charter schools get 2 F's in a row, they're closed. So we don't let low-performing charter schools continue to operate year after year after year. We also have a lot of digital learning options. Florida has the Florida Virtual School. It is a K-12 school that any public-private homeschool student can take courses in, and we have more and more students from our public schools who participate in the Florida Virtual School, so they can supplement their education schedule and their curriculum and work ahead. All of our 67 school districts also are required to offer district virtual options, and we have a policy called course choice, I think, here, so that any student in any school district can take a course offered in another district. We have such variation in our school districts. We have some that have 800 students and some that have 300,000 students. And so there's no way that the school district that has 800 students can offer the different types of courses as the school district that has nearly 400,000 students. So our students, the student in Sopchoppy in North Florida, can take other courses and electives that are offered in other school districts where they might have more variety and more options. And the funding follows the student to whatever district provided the education. So in closing, for what we did, you can see that in all of the things that Florida did, there was a lot of progress. So we are 5th in the country now for closing racial and economic achievement gaps, 4th for the progress of our African American students, 3rd for low-income students, and as Matt's already said, 1st in the country for the gains that our students with disabilities have made. I'm going to turn it over to Mike, who was a reporter with the Orlando Sentinel when we started these reforms.
I'm not giving you any data, so. My brother moved to Maine over 20 years ago, and now he's back in Florida covering the Red Sox for the Press-Herald. So we crossed paths, and now I'm here. I started for Maine on the Appalachian Trail, leaving Georgia several years ago, and ran out of cartilage in Virginia, so I never made it. Just a quick aside, my daughter, she had her name picked out of the hat a couple years ago to go to the highest performing charter in Orange County. And so we went and checked out the charter, and it was great, and we kept her in the traditional public school. And it was a great choice. So, but we had that choice, and now she's in 8th grade, and she's taken a virtual history course. And so there's just all sorts of neat options, because her history course she was in wasn't working out, and it wasn't rigorous enough. So we've got her on an online thing, and she's working with the teacher and producing all these incredible reports and learning how to do research on the web. So, and she's on her way to an IB magnet now. So anyway, well, unlike Governor LePage, I lived the dream of being a truck driver, and so that's a reason not to major in political science if you want to tell your kids that. And I took one step up and became a newspaper columnist, and of course a very liberal one. And so when Jeb Bush was elected governor in 1998, by then I had voted against him twice, 94 and 98. And so he came in and, of course, did everything that we hated, lowered taxes and reduced government. But education was the main thing, and he just turned the public education system upside down. And the grading formula that Patricia mentioned, if a school got 2 consecutive Fs, the kids were eligible for a voucher to a private school. The 3rd grade retention, and so, you know, people were just sort of aghast, and I thought it was kind of cruel, and this comes up. Yes, that was what I wrote about it at the time. And I kind of beat up on Governor Bush quite a bit, and that was one of my columns. And this was, he wrote a response to this, a letter to the editor. So we kind of had this back and forth going, and some of the readers picked up on it. And so I ran this in my column, and this was my response. And then when the school grades started coming out, we had, in Orange County, I believe we had 8 failing schools. It was all over the front page. And schools that people never heard of before, Molly Ray, all these low-income schools that nobody even knew existed. Suddenly, everybody knew they existed. And it just really kicked off an incredible response. Principals were pulled out, ineffective principals. Effective teachers were brought in, curriculum were brought in. Business groups like the Home Builders Association adopted a school. And so you would see these schools that had gotten Fs, and you know, a couple years later, you know, they were on the front page, and all the kids were waving their hands, and they had all gotten As. And so the amount that they're able to turn around schools when they really put good leadership and strong teachers in there, it's just amazing. With the elementary schools, the higher grades are more difficult, but they achieved incredible progress, and so suddenly these schools that were the most ignored in the system became the priority. And that's one revelation I reached, and that just drove my colleagues in the newsroom crazy, because that was just a total disconnect for them, that a conservative governor named Bush, you know, had done more to move the needle on low-income education. Let me see. And this took me to the vouchers. There was much screaming about the voucher program they had, where you got 2 Fs and the kids got a voucher to transfer out of the school. And this was supposed to drain public education and destroy public education. But if you actually looked at it, the vouchers were so restricted and so limited to those schools that I think statewide maybe 800 were actually issued. And then once the school got that second F, the State Department of Education just came in with clubs and started beating the school district. And the school district would be moving in principals. I mean, they would move heaven and earth to get rid of those F grades. So the purpose of the vouchers was to get rid of the vouchers, you know, when you think about it. And I think the courts threw the vouchers out at some point, and everybody was going, yay. And at that point, there was like 500 or 600 vouchers out there. But the impact, it wasn't the vouchers, it was the impact they had in forcing the schools to change, because suddenly, for the first time, they didn't have a captive population of customers. And that was a major motivation. That was, towards the end of my career, I used to really get on the governor's, I used to really irritate him by calling him a liberal. For these gains that he was producing in low-income schools. And like Evans, the school that Patricia mentioned to you, they now have an international baccalaureate program. They've just had a $95 million new campus built. It's become the whole center of that community. And this is a school that was completely ignored and just written off, ignored by the school board. And one rather diabolical thing that they did was when they, one option you had when you had a double failing school was those kids could move to other schools. And then all of a sudden, you know, these kids are moving around, and it just created this huge pressure for people over here who never cared about schools over there suddenly cared a whole lot about them, and it had a major impact. And this is my last one, but if you saw those gains, you know, that Patricia and Matt showed you, and you said, well, what we did was we spent $500 billion on education. I mean, the unions, everybody go crazy. They'd love it, but they didn't they didn't do it that way. They just sort of made the system, you know, change. If you throw money into something that's not working very well, it's not by definition going to improve the way it works. So how you spend the money matters quite a bit. So anyway, that's my presentation.
We're happy to take any questions that you may have on those crazy things that we did in the state. No? No questions from anyone? Well, thank you for having us. Oh, yes.
I understand that there was a ripple effect that went up into the college level as well. Now, one of the discoveries, I guess questions somebody else made, was that we had a very high degree of remediation that was costing a fortune. So you set limits on the amount of remediation in the college and the higher education level. That cut costs. And you also had, you said you could no longer be a student longer than 7 years. And that had the effect of turning out students that were living from student loan to student loan to student loan and never graduated. Can you talk a bit about that kind of ripple through effect as it impacted on the higher education?
Sure. One of the things that Governor Bush used to say is he would be thrilled if our next crisis was that we had so many students prepared for college that we didn't have room for them. And I didn't have one of the charts up there, but you can actually track in Florida every time we raised the bar on high school graduation or started putting more into getting kids better prepared for college, you could see like a 2-year trailer effect on our remediation rate going down in community colleges, so that we were producing better prepared students to enter the higher education system. And the other policy that you can see is you can track the first semester fall after a student's high school graduation to see how many pursued post-secondary education. And at least the last time I looked at that data, we had had a 13% increase in the number of students pursuing post-secondary education after the reforms were put in place. I think some of the questions you were asking about limiting a student in higher education to 7 years, we didn't actually do it that way and say you could only take post-secondary education for 7 years. What the state did say was that we're going to fund a certain number of credit hours. And so if most of our degrees are capped at 120 credit hours, and so the state will fund up to 10% over that, so that it gives kids the ability, these young college kids, they can change their mind and change majors. But once a student wants to take more than 132 hours, they start having to pay a greater share of their tuition. So it certainly motivates parents to make sure their kids were on track and figured out what degree they wanted to take, because the costs started increasing. And there were some cost increases if a student took a course, like drop added too many times. So it was the third time that they were trying to take a course, they had to pay a greater share. We did some of those things in higher education. Are there any more questions? Yes.
Thank you.
What's your name and where are you from?
I'm Bill Matthews. I'm on the board of RSU2 locally here. Given that you have 3 times as many kids in your Florida schools as we have people in Maine, I'm curious how your figures map over rural versus urban districts.
That's a great question. And what we can do is we can do a breakdown like that and get it to Governor LePage and Steve so that you can see. But basically the gains have tracked in rural, in urban, in small districts, in large districts, that you can see the growth and the gains in all of our different districts. We do have a very different district makeup. We have very rural, very small, and then these super gigantic mega districts. I think we have more mega districts than any other state. But you can track the progress. Now, in almost all of our districts, there are still, I mean, you could see the chart, we still have about 200 DNF schools. The good news is those are different schools. They're not the same schools year after year after year after year. On that chart that showed the number of A, B schools versus DNF, we had a growth of probably 500 schools over that period of time also. And so because a lot of the numbers of the DNF schools were new charter startups that had targeted a low-performing, low-income population, and they get closed after 2 Fs. Or they improve, like the KIPP school in Jacksonville got an F the first year and the second year got a B. So we have seen the progress over all different types, rural schools, urban schools, suburban schools.
All right, good. That way I don't need to... Sir, we're going to use the microphone, but go ahead. What was your question again?
I'm curious about that policy, how it related to ELL students and also your special ed population.
Sure, thank you. That's a great question. I usually have a slide, but because of our time, we were trying to cut it down. We do have some what are called good cause exemptions. So students who are English language learners who have had less than 2 years of English instruction, students with disabilities who don't take the state tests, students with disabilities who've been previously retained, they get good cause exemptions to be promoted. So that difference on that one slide between the number of kids who couldn't read and the number of students who were retained, some of that is because we do make some exceptions for ELL and students with disabilities on that population.
Okay. Sir, what's your name?
Ken Koval,
Where are you from?
Superintendent of RSU 74. And the question, Anson, New Portland, Solon, Emden. The question is, could you discuss the NECRI critique relating to the Florida grading system and the scores in relation to poverty levels of the schools?
Was that the Oklahoma?
That's the DeCarlo NECRI critique?
I'm familiar with it.
Could you discuss that?
You can do it. I'll talk to you.
Yeah, I mean, basically, DeCarlo's point was that, or the way I would interpret his point is that, you know, although the economic achievement gap is closed in Florida, it hasn't gone away.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's still there. It's just smaller than it used to be. So he basically said, well, look, the F schools tend to be poorer than the A schools and whatnot. And that is still the case. However, I actually wrote a response to his critique where I said, look, the key thing is the way the formula is structured, and Patricia walked you through that. The real magic of the grading formula is the fact that the bottom 25% of your school grade comes from the gains of the kids who scored in the bottom 25% on last year's test. Okay? So basically the kids at the bottom. So the formula is half proficiency, 25% gains for all students. Where were they at the end of last year? Where at the end of this year? And finally, the bottom 25%. Okay? They don't have to pass, right? They don't have to score proficient, but they have to be making gains, right? This makes them the most important kids in the school building, right? The kids at the bottom 25% from last year, and this is much more elegant than in No Child Left Behind, which divides students up into these various ethnic subgroups and kids with disabilities and ELL, right? This is basically the kids who are not doing well for whatever reason. They are the only group of students that count on all three categories, right? They count against overall proficiency, they count against overall gains, and then they have their own category for gains, okay? That is a big driving reason why we see this big improvement amongst, disadvantaged student groups, whether it's African Americans, Hispanics, children with disabilities, ELL, rural, urban, you name it, the scores are going up. It's certainly not the case that again, Florida's not, education nirvana. Everything's not perfect. Some people could, like DeCarlo did, he looked at the system and said, it's not fair. My response to that is, it's a huge step in the right direction. It's producing the kind of results we want, and it's lowering these achievement gaps. So whether or not everyone thinks it's fair is kind of beside the point to me. To me, the question is it useful? And it's clearly very useful if what you want to do is help disadvantaged students.
And I think part of his report was, if you looked at the DNF schools, they are low-income schools. They're Title I schools, or they're charter schools that serve low-income students. And he was trying to say that grading schools A through F means you just give wealthy schools A's and you give low-income schools F's. And what he ignored was, if you look at that number of A and B schools in the state, I think last year's 2,200, there are nearly 900 of those schools that are making A's and B's that are majority low income and serve majority minority student populations. So the grading system doesn't give F's to low income and A's to high income schools. What it does is it gives A's and B's to schools that are making progress with kids, that are teaching kids how to learn, and that there are nearly 1,000 of those schools in the state that are primarily low income, primarily serve minority students, where the kids are making fantastic progress. And what I think our school districts are doing is they're learning from those schools that are making a difference with a really disadvantaged population, and then trying to apply those same principles to the other schools that they're trying to turn around.
We have time for one more question. And what's your name and where are you from?
Frank Sherburne, Bonnie Eagle. I like your third grade policy. So tell me a little bit about the interventions that you put into place so that reading scores did go up, so you weren't seeing a lot of students being retained. I'm sure there was probably some retention there. So how did you deal with that political quagmire of the constituency that feels very strongly about no retention?
Sure. So that's a great question. We did a lot of things related to intervening early with kindergarten, first, second, and third graders. Basically, if you look at the last bullet, we have early literacy screeners. And so within the first 30 days of kindergarten, first, second, third grade, students get an early literacy screen so that teachers know in the first 30 days which kids are on track, have the right level of reading skills, which ones aren't. And the students that are at risk, the students who are not on the right track, what our schools have to do is come up with a customized, for students with disabilities, it's called an individual education plan. For our low-performing readers, it's an individual reading plan, because there are children that have different reading deficiencies. Some students can't read because they have a problem with fluency, so they don't read quickly enough in order to remember what they started reading when they first started reading. Others have phonemic awareness problems. They don't recognize letters and sounds. Others have a comprehension problem. They just don't understand the vocabulary of what they're reading. And so depending on what was the deficiency of the child in reading, there's actually a grid that our Department of Education produced and gave to reading coaches, and reading coaches were put into the schools to help teachers learn, and even teachers that were not teaching English language arts, so that to help the social studies teacher or the science teacher know what to do to help with reading instruction in their subject matter. But there's a grid that we have charts that show if you have a child with this type of a deficiency in their reading skill, this is what that child needs, so that we don't want to repeat and retain kids for the sake of retention. That was not the point of the policy. The policy was, how do we get kids who are ready to move to fourth grade who are reading? And that required a lot of intervention and specific reading plans and reading coaches deployed in kindergarten, first, second, third grade, so that we had a customized approach to that intervention in kindergarten, first, and second grade.
Thank you, panel. We appreciate it. That was excellent.